Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Journey to Babel, which is episode 15 of season 2 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Original Series, one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover Journey to Babel. So Journey to Babel is the episode when Kirk and crew are transporting a group of Federation delegates to a conference where they're going to decide on the fate of a world, whether or not it gets to join the Federation. There's lots of different members, different species from the Federation, including Tellarites, Andorians, and Vulcans, and the Vulcan ambassador just so happens to be Spock's father, who we find out are estranged. So during the scene, this Tellarite ambassador is killed. Sarek is the most likely suspect, but then Sarek has medical issues where his life is in danger, and Spock is the only one who can save him. But Spock is otherwise occupied because Kirk is attacked by an Orion disguised as an Andorian as part of an Orion plot to stop the delegates from getting to the peace conference because it benefits the Orions that this planet does not join the Federation. However, Kirk manages to fool Spock into doing the surgery anyway, but he stays in the command and is able to outwit the Orions and save the day. So this is a fan favorite, very popular episode, and I'll be honest, I never was that big of a fan of it. Now, I don't think it's a terrible episode, to be sure. In fact, I'm curious why I forgot to mention this. It should have been mentioned in my top overrated episodes, because I do think it's a tad bit overrated, but not a bad episode, mind you. I just never been as big of a fan of this episode as everyone else seemed to be, and there are things I like about it, but yeah, it's just, I wouldn't call it one of the best of the show. But it's definitely, sitting through season 2, it's definitely one of the better episodes of season 2, and I've talked a bit about how I don't really like season 2 of the original series. There's just a lot of really bland episodes where they go to an Earth-like planet, or they just try to be like a Western, and I hate those episodes. And season 2 definitely has the most of those type of episodes, but there's, the few good episodes that really stand out, like Doomsday Machine, The Changeling, Mirror, which of course are amazing episodes. And while I don't think this episode is as good as those, it definitely stands up as one of the better episodes of season 2. It's kind of a nice break from the mediocrity minutia and something that's actually quite good. But I want to emphasize how much I do like this episode first, because I'm probably going to spend most of this review complaining about it. But the thing that I like most about this episode is the world building. I think this is probably the first and the best episode of the original series to world build. Because we heard this term, the Federation and the United Federation of Planets, thrown around before, but it's very casual. And of course, it didn't come until later in the first season. At first, they would call it an Earth vessel or Earth probe or something like that. It wasn't until Arena, the episode Arena, which I believe was the 21st episode of the first season, where they mentioned the Federation, and then A Taste of Armageddon, which came a few episodes later, where they officially mentioned the United Federation of Planets. And then that stuck, and I do like that it stuck, because they could have just went back and forth and been wishy-washy, but it seems like they were trying to establish some kind of continuity to be consistent. And in this episode, we actually get to see other members of the Federation. We get introduced to long-running species that will become staples of Star Trek, the Andorians and the Tellarites. Now, both of these species are seen only seen in the background for the rest of the original series. Oh, and the Orions, I should say, but we were actually introduced to Orion slave girls in the very first episode, The Cage, and I think they made appearances before and after then as well, but I can't recall. But we actually are introduced to them more, although we don't actually see them because it's the one that's disguised as Andorian. But regardless, the Andorians and the Tellarites never really make an appearance in the original series again, other than like appearing as background characters, which I find to be nice continuity, nice world building for the rest of the series. That episodes like Whom Gods Destroy and The Lights of Zatur, we just happen to see random Andorians in the background or whatever, and I think we see a Tellarite in Whom Gods Destroy as well. So just building that this Federation exists, and these are staple species of the Federation, and so it's nice little world building. But it wasn't actually until all the way till Enterprise where both these species were actually developed a lot more outside of this episode, where we actually got to see the Andorians, of course, were really explored through the reoccurring character of Shran, who is a really great reoccurring character of Enterprise, of course, played by the great Jeffrey Combs. And the Tellarites didn't really get their due. Well, there was one bounty hunter Tellarite guy who appeared in the second season, but that episode kind of sucked. I don't think the Tellarites really got their due until the fourth season of Enterprise, with the Babel 1 United Arinar trilogy that they had there, which really delved more into the Tellarites, and actually, I would say, developed them or explored them even more than this episode did. It was but it was obviously based off of this episode, and then they became staples of newer Trek, making a lot of appearances in Lower Decks, and of course the Arinar, which is an offshoot of the Andorians. Was the main character in the first season of Strange New Worlds, and so they explore these characters, or these races, I should say, these alien races more, and they're mentioned a lot throughout all Star Trek franchises. There's references in them littered throughout Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager as well. So they became staples, and this is the episode that introduced it, because it was saying these are Federation members. Now, the thing, though, that I was kind of iffy about, and I think I talked about this in other videos, is that they're kind of... I feel like the betrayal of the United Federation of Planets in this episode makes it more like the United Nations. Like, it's a loose sort of alliance of like these planets that have their own government, have their own way of governing, but they have this organization that they go to sort out, interstellar matters that affect them all, So I felt like it was like the United Nations, whereas later incarnations of Star Trek, particularly Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, I would say portray the United Federation of Planets more of like the United States or the United Kingdom, where there is really the United Federation of Planets is the nation. It's one nation. It's just different factions within that nation. If you know what I'm saying. But it could be, in the universe, you could say, well, 100 years later, it became more like the United States, but at this stage, it was more like the United Nations. I thought another comparison, most recently, as I was watching this episode, it could be actually what might be more apt than the United Nations comparison is like the European Union type of comparison, where that's a bit more, it's not as, like, firm as, say, the United States, where it's like each state is a part of one nation, but it's more firm than like United Nations, which is just a diplomatic entity where every nation is sovereign and separate. Where the European Union, now I don't live in Europe, so pardon my ignorance, but from what I understand, each nation is separate, but they are combined more definitely more than the United Nations. They're unified in trade. They make trade and travel between each nation a lot easier. Like people can work and live from one country to another within the European Union without requiring all these visas and documents that you would with other countries. So it's a bit more firm, but not the same as say United States or United Kingdom as just one country. So maybe that's more of like how they're portraying the United Federation of Planets in this episode. But it reminds me like of especially of shows and movies that portray the United Nations. This really felt like this. Maybe that's probably why it's evoking the image of United Nations, because it has the different ambassadors arguing with each other. Oh, how are you going to vote on this? And also, I feel like they gave the televised Andorians accents like that sort of mimic like European accents to try to portray them as like, again, to evoke that image of United Nations of having the different people with the different accents voting and different ambassadors and whatnot. So really that's what it felt like to me. But I could be wrong, but that's just that's what it evoked to me, and maybe other people didn't feel this way. I'm not saying that this is definitely definitely what they meant. It was just my interpretation of it, but regardless, I do like the work they do in and to me, I gotta say, world building is like one of the most important things of Star Trek to me. It's what made me a Star Trek fan, and honestly, it's why I prefer the Next Generation era, because they did much more to world build than the original series did, which is part of the reason why I'm not as big of an into the original series. And that's also why Deep Space Nine in particular is my favorite show, because other than, in contrast to Next Gen, and the original series and Voyager, instead of traveling just a ship traveling to planet to planet to planet and going on different adventures and meeting different aliens that they never speak of ever again week to week, Deep Space Nine more of established the location, established a firm world building. It established this is the Federation, this is the Klingon Empire, this is Romulan Empire here, this is Cardassians here, and this is their interactions, and they delved more into that world building, and so I think that's a huge part of why Deep Space Nine is my favorite show, because I've always been about the world building. Now I know not everyone feels this way, not all Star Trek fans. Everyone has their different avenues and different things they like, the why they like Star Trek, and of course that's fine. It's great, different, but I think that explains the differences in why some people are more touchy about canon than others, because some people maybe don't. World building is maybe not what attracted them to Star Trek. Maybe it was like the moral implications, or just they liked the characters, or they just like the concept of traveling to different planet week to week, and so when canon is violated, they don't care, because that's not what they're into the show. But those like myself who are into world building, who want this established universe, and that's what attracts us to the franchise, we're going to be a little bit more touchy about when they violate canon, because they are destroying that world building that we like so much. But I've talked about canon a lot in other videos, and how I'm willing to let some things go, but other things, if it's too dire, it just bothers me. But other things, if it leads to good storytelling, I'm willing to be a bit lenient. But the world building is why I like Star Trek. Or not the only reason, obviously, but a big one. So that's why I appreciate this episode in particular. Not only does it do the great world building, it also does great character building with Spock, giving a backstory to Spock, meeting his parents, and how he has a bad relationship with his father because he never became a scientist, and seeing his mother as an emotional human, and the different, and how that informs who he became. It is really well done, and it's something that I appreciate a lot. So yeah, and so mainly for those reasons I like this episode. So now let me get into reasons why I don't like this episode as much as maybe some others. Why I wouldn't call it one of the best of the show, which I wouldn't. And I was thinking about this a lot since I watched this episode just a couple days ago, and I think the phrase that would best describe my complaint about this episode is manufactured drama. Now, I think this is different than contrived writing, which I talked about before, because contrived writing is when the writers need something in the plot to happen because they have this idea of a plot and they need these events to happen in order for their particular plot to happen. So they have someone act out of character, or they have something that's scientifically inaccurate, or they have, something behaving in the way it shouldn't just so they can do the plot. That's contrived writing, and I don't think this episode is contrived per se. There's nothing that's like completely out of place or out of character in this episode, but I would call it more of manufactured drama. It feels kind of unearned. Particularly like there's just too many coincidences. Like when they're having this meeting and Sarah gets in an argument with this Telluride, and then the Telluride is murdered, who we find out by Orion, but of course Sarek is the main suspect. Now this is a very common device. It's not contrived, but it's a very common device that's done a lot, which is part of the reason why I'm not a big fan of it. Is they implicate have these two guys arguing, and that one of them is murdered, so our hero or someone our hero cares about is the one implicated in the murder, and he's actually innocent. Like that's very cliche, but that in itself is not that big of a deal. But the fact is they didn't really do it. It's there for no reason. It's like there's only 5 minutes of the episode where they're considering Sarek a murder suspect, and then they quickly forget about it and it's dropped and never brought up again, so it's kind of pointless. And also just the coincidence comes on board just this time while they're on this mission, and while Sarek is accused of murder, it just so happens that he succumbs to this illness and needs a life-saving transplant. Like, isn't that convenient? It has, again, not a contrivance because it's not completely contrived or out of place, but it feels more like manufactured drama. And also the scene, and one scene I had the biggest issue with was the scene where Spock was telling his mother that he couldn't do the surgery because he had to be in command of the ship. And so this is actually contrived. There is a contrived element to this. And the contrived element is that Spock should just give over command to Scotty. The reason why he's not, he's saying, it has regulations stated me as first officer has to be in command. I think that's bullshit. I think that he could very easily turn over command to Scotty, but chooses not to because the plot required it. So that's a contrived moment. But the scene itself is more of a manufactured drama because the way that his mother is like yelling at him and getting all emotional and screaming and then slaps him in the face. That felt very artificial. It felt very melodramatic to me. Especially since, in contrast in the previous scenes, when Spock was trying to convince everyone else that he was the only one to be the donor for Sarek, and he had to save Sarek's life. In that case, his mother and McCoy were arguing against him. It's like, Spock, you'll risk your life. This is impossible. And Spock is like arguing hard out, no, I need to freaking be the donor. And then 5 minutes later, they're telling him he needs to do the surgery, and he's like, no, I can't be the donor because I got to be the captain. So all of a sudden they switch from being, we can't do this because Spock is risking his life too. Spock, why the fuck aren't you doing this? You should be doing it. It felt very jarring and inconsistent in manufactured drama. I keep coming back to this term because that's really how I felt about the whole thing, and the whole thing about Sarek's medical condition felt like manufactured drama. Again, not contrivance. The only contrivance I would point to is the Scotty thing. He could have just as easily turned command to Scotty, but more of, it felt like a soap opera-y. It felt very soap opera-y in a way that didn't flow well, if you know what I'm saying. And the other issue I would bring up with this episode is the plot with the Orions, because this is what I felt through whenever I watched this episode in the 90s when I was a teenager. It wasn't until actually newer incarnations of Star Trek like Enterprise and Lower Decks where we explore the Orions more, and they sort of establish the Orions more as a species. I'm not going to mention Deep Space Nine as the Orion Syndicate because that's totally inconsistent, because the Orion Syndicate as portrayed in Deep Space Nine, there's no fucking Orions in it. Now there's a lot of reasons why, and I've heard good explanations of why that is and why that could be, but that's why I'm not bringing up Deep Space Nine as an example, because it didn't really get into the Orions the way that Enterprise and Lower Decks did. So watching it after seeing those shows, I got a more firm grasp on who the Orions are. But when I first saw this episode, and when I saw it throughout the 90s before Enterprise came out, I had no idea who the Orions were. And it felt like, and they have a throwaway line, a blink if you miss line at the end of the episode that explains, oh, the Orions want the mining rights for this or whatever. They pirate this world that's joining the Federation. If it joins the Federation, they won't be able to pirate it. And at the same time, they're destabilizing all these other, Federation members like the Tellarites and the Vulcans, and that's why they're creating havoc, which does make sense. But they don't really hammer that point. They just have a throwaway line at the end of the episode. This is the motivation of the species. We've never really seen before except for Orion slave girls, but you have to make that connection in your head. And they're not really established. And so this is the part of the world building that failed to me, was the Orions. The whole time they play the episode off as a mystery of who is the one doing it. Who is this mystery Andorian? He's not an Andorian. They find out who is he, why are they doing this, what's going on, who is this mysterious ship. It's a mystery. Who is it? Who's doing this? And the answer is some alien species that's not really developed or explored and that we never really heard about. So is that a very satisfying solution? I don't think it is. Now, there is one more appearance of the Orions I should mention that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about, well, actually me in the comments, which is the animated series where they have the Pirates of Orion. Don't get me started on that. But that's actually my favorite episode of the animated series, because that does develop the Orions more. It does what this episode failed to do, and it focuses more on them and gives them more of the motivation. They felt more concrete to me. But I guess I didn't bring it up because I didn't watch the animated series until the 2000s, but you could say, well, just because you didn't watch it didn't mean it didn't exist. It was out there, so they were explored before Enterprise. Okay, fair, but they weren't explored during the original series. Just the animated series, and I don't care what anybody says, it's still, to me, and to many people, not just to me, but to everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people, the animated series is a bit less than canon. I'm sorry if you think that's not true, but that's how a lot of people perceive it. And I think there's a good reason for it, but I don't want to get sidetracked and diverted on that whole argument here. And so, so that's why I wouldn't really count the Pirates of Orion in establishing that. But anyway, I do think in real canon, it's established more in Enterprise and newer Star Trek, modern Star Trek shows. But yeah, just going off the original series itself, like, I don't care about them. Like, the Orions are responsible for this, and they're the ones who are trying to destroy the Enterprise. Okay, so, like, why do I care? And that's something that's, that I think is kind of a fault of this episode. Now, there's one other thing I wanted to bring up this episode that one of my patrons will mention in the comment, but it really is something I've always noticed, even when I was a teenager when watching this show. It has the worst edit in the entire original series, the most jarring edit, where we see Spock and the sick bay. I think this is when he was trying to convince McCoy and his mother that he had to do the surgery or something like that. It was this like emotional scene, and it hard cuts to Kirk fighting the Andorian, and the Andorian like trying to stab, who we find out is actually Orion later on, but who stabs Kirk. Now, they don't set up this scene at all. They don't establish that why this guy might want to attack Kirk, or that he is maybe going to attack Kirk. It just comes out of nowhere, where he just all of a sudden it just hard cuts to is the worst edit, the worst transition in the entire show. Now, I feel like there was a deleted scene, that there was something setting up and that they cut out, but they did a terrible job at it to make it extremely jarring. That's what I could be wrong. That's how it feels like to me. In fact, when I first watched the original series on syndication, and they did they did cut like a little bit of the scenes out in some of the episodes to fit the format of syndication. One example is Mirror Mirror, because I watched it now like on DVD or on Paramount Plus and Netflix, what have you. They had the full version, which I saw because I taped it off the TV and watched it from syndication over and over again. I had that original version in my mind that has some of these scenes cut, so it's a bit jarring for me because I'm not used to these scenes being there, so it's almost like an extended version. So I thought, well, maybe that was the case with this episode, and maybe it was the syndication edit that made that such a terrible edit, but no. This is the full version that they have on Paramount Plus and Netflix and whatnot, and it still has a terrible edit. So if there was a deleted scene, it never saw the light of day. It's just, God, such a terrible edit. But anywho, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had to say about this episode. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is it was one of my favorite lines, actually, of this episode. One of my favorite Kirk moments of the show is when Kirk is fighting the Orion ship, and Uhura mentions, all our channels, our communication channels are all tied up because all the ambassadors are asking to know what's going on, and Kirk's like, tell them to take a good guess, but clear the channels. I love that. That was such a great Kirk moment for him. Tell them to take a good guess. It's just how frustrated he was. And I will say that makes a lot of sense, that the ambassadors would be like very, demanding and all high mighty and demanding to know what's going on. But Kirk's response is just priceless. Like I fucking love that moment. It's such a good moment of the show. But yeah. So, as I said, it's a decent episode, but I just wouldn't call it one of the best of the show. So, now, of course, I would like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. Of course, very much appreciate it. Show my appreciation. I shall give you a shout out in this video. So, there is Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Brian A., Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you all so very much for your support. It's very much appreciated. And as always, I have a few patron comments to read on this episode that some of the patrons left for me. So first comment is from Maddie Jester that says, I am a fan of this episode. There's plenty to enjoy here. Mark Leonard Sarek is great. There's political intrigue and a murder mystery too. I'm not quite sold on Spock's reasoning for not giving command to Scotty. Ambassador Sarek is pretty important to the diplomatic mission. Surely saving his life is in line with his duties. I suppose there's a bit of a nitpick. All in all, this is a really good trek from DC Fontana. 8.5 Andorian antennas out of 10. You're doing the 0.5 thing. That's very anti-me, but that's all good. Next comment is from Ricky, who says, yes, another classic and great episode from TOS. Again, like Amok Time, this episode gives Spock character growth, and it's so great to see all the other alien races, like the Andorians, Tellarites, and Vulcans as well, as it does world building for the Trek universe. The scenes with Sarek were pretty good, and I also enjoyed the assassination attempt on the Enterprise, although there are nitpicks, like when Sarek needed heart surgery, Spock wouldn't pass command to Scotty to help his father to save his life. I found this extremely contrived, and then there's the scene when Kirk and the Andorian are fighting. Out of nowhere, we just jump into that scene. I mean, that is one of the worst editing I've ever seen. So it does hold this episode back from being top tier quality, so my rating is a 9 out of 10. Still a lot more favorable to this episode than I would be. But it's interesting that everyone's bringing up that Spock not giving command to Scotty thing is being dumb, because I totally agree with that. Anyway, last comment is from Brandon Neil Howells, who says, Journey to Babel. A good idea, but why doesn't Kirk know that Sarek and Amanda are Spock's parents? It's cool to see the Andorians and Tellarites, even if the Tellarite masks are as piss poor as their manners. I find Spock being the only person with compatible blood for Sarek's operation exceedingly contrived. Spock can't pass command on to Scotty, but Kirk can resume command after being stabbed. Come the fuck on. And let's end with a joke about Vulcan logic between Spock and Sarek. 5 fanged teddy bears out of 10. So Brandon definitely less positive on this episode. Fanged teddy bears, did forget to talk about that. The whole scene where Amanda told McCoy that Spock had a teddy bear as a kid. And McCoy is like, a teddy bear, and like gonna give Spock a lot of shit about it. And Spock, very stone faced, was like, our teddy bears on Vulcan are alive and have 6-inch fangs, or whatever he said. Then they're not teddy bears. Why did she call it a teddy bear? It's more akin to like a pet tiger. Why would she call a pet tiger a teddy bear? It makes no fucking sense. And of course, we actually see the Selloc in the animated series and in Enterprise, and especially in Enterprise, they're like these deadly tiger shit things. Now, apparently, the one that Spock had was a domesticated version. It was younger and whatnot, and we saw in the animated series that was a bit docile or whatever. But still, why would you call that a teddy bear? That makes no sense. But anyway, my rating for Journey to Babel out of 10 is going to be a 7. Very good. So, yeah, a bit more positive than Brandon, but not as positive as the others. I do like this episode, as I said, like the world building they do, I do very much appreciate it. It was an engaging episode. Definitely sticks out from the mediocrity of season 2. It's a nice break from said mediocrity of season 2, and so it's definitely a strong episode, but there's too much manufactured drama is basically what it comes down to. Too much that felt soap opera or unearned, or people just acting high and very high emotions for no reason, and the the Orions are just not really explored and kind of come out of nowhere, and I don't really care. It's like this big mystery. Ooh, who's doing this? It's the Orions. Whoop-de-doo. Why do I care? So that doesn't, that never, so I don't love this episode as much as many others who would call this the best of Star Trek. It wouldn't make my top 10. Probably not. Maybe my top 20, but probably, I don't know. Probably not. We'll see. But anyway, So yeah, 7 out of 10 from me. So that is it for my review of Journey to Babel. Thanks so much for checking out my channel and checking out this review. So now, as always, we'll try to let you know what is coming up on Enchantment of Eternity. So this Thursday, of course, will be my newest review for Picard, Season 3. And then on Saturday, I will return with another TOS review, A Private Little War. And then the following Monday, another review on my channel, original review, The Gamesters of Triskelion. So that's what's coming up on Enchantment of Eternity. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to cover original series and also covering many other Star Trek shows and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.